I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we contemplate the election of Donald Trump just about 48 hours ago in the wee morning of November 6th. A lot has happened in America that culminated in this election, and I think it's very important for us as progressives, for those associated with the Democratic Party, for U.S. citizens generally, for citizens of the world globally, given the dominance of the United States in global affairs, to ponder very thoughtfully what just took place so that we can learn from this event and hopefully rectify some of the vectors that produced a decisive victory for Donald Trump and the Republicans at a moment when the other path, the path not taken, could and should have been taken had there been greater awareness of the realities of the public and the realities of the real world. So I want to take a few minutes today to offer some tentative reflections, knowing that we're only 2 days from the election, always in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. But I think there are some issues that are worth pondering. Probably the essential demographic fact, which I'm going to use as a prism today through which to understand what happened, is simply the popular vote. Donald Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton in 2016. He lost the popular vote to Joe Biden by 5 million, even a greater number. Hillary Clinton got 3 million. Joe Biden won by 5 million votes. And yet, against Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump defeated her by about 5 million votes. What's very important to understand is that the victory in popular vote did not happen because the Republicans received more votes than they did in 2020, for example. Trump got about 70 million. What took place is that roughly 10 million fewer Democrats voted. And I think around this central fact, the understanding that we need to explore in terms of what happened needs to take place. So that's what I would like to do for a few minutes today. I think there are a couple of reasons for this reality of Trump getting the 70 million again and the Democrats losing 10 million, which resulted in the really resounding victory of Trump and the Republicans in the election itself. I think there are two reasons why this took place. One is, despite everything that the Democrats and the mainstream media tried to throw at Trump as being a corrupt politician, a convicted convict, a felon, a womanizer, a dictator, and all the things that were said about him. This did not move his electorate, because I think there is a deeper reality about Donald Trump that has been ignored and was ignored by the Democrats. And that is that he's an extraordinary historical figure. And it's the lack of appreciation of this that gave rise to the complacency on the part of the Democrats, and the reason, I think, centrally, why they lost the election. The Democrats thought that what they really needed to do was to continue to remind the American public that Trump is a seriously bad guy, which may be true. But the deeper reality is that he's an extraordinary bad guy. And he is the first president in US history to be defeated and come back again in the way that he has. And he has exerted powerful influence as president of the United States and a candidate for the presidency before that, through the sheer force of will. And, you know, when one looks back over history, one often finds that a personality emerges that is bigger than the structures that contain most people and within which most people live their lives as conventionally oriented beings. Occasionally in history, big personalities burst out, and through the sheer force of their personality, dominate those around them, and in some ways distort politics, but also bend politics to their will. And in an extraordinarily, almost perverse way, the negative personality characteristics that they also possessed make them an attractive figure. This is an important psychosocial observation to make. If you're in the box and you're living according to the rules of the box, then the ethical norms constrain you. But if you've broken outside the box, the ethical norms of the box itself no longer constrain, and a new charismatic, attractive force begins to exert gravitational pull, as it did on 70 million Americans who voted for Trump in 2020 and in 2024. I had the extraordinary privilege, actually, of working with Boris Yeltsin in the Soviet Union, and during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he then became president, the first president of an independent Russia in 1992 through the year 2000. And he was a similar figure. I traveled with him. I watched his impact on people, and it was quite extraordinary. Even when we were in the White House together, meeting with the President of the United States, George Bush Sr. Yeltsin radiated a certain charismatic power that was like a distortion field. I've only met Trump once, and this was many, many years ago when we were traveling with Gorbachev in New York City, actually, in 1992. But it was clear to me then that he had an extraordinary charismatic gravitational field around him. And that takes people to extraordinary places. If they set an intention, as Trump did, to become president of the United States. And I think that this impulse, combined with the near assassination experiences that he endured in the course of the election, created a certain mystique that was able to withstand all the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune, as Shakespeare would have put it. And the arrows shot by the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz simply splintered and had no measurable effect. But the personality of Trump is only part of the reason for his victory, in my view. The more fundamental, systemic reason for his victory is what Ralph Nader has said in the last day, that what we're witnessing is the collapse of the Democratic Party. And I'd like to dwell on that because I think what we're witnessing is, in fact, what Nader is observing. That Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have presided over an administration that is overseeing the collapse of the American imperium and the bankruptcy of the Democratic Party. Let me explain. The Democratic Party rose to prominence in American politics in the late 1920s with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The country had just gone through the Great Depression. 25 or 30% of the American public were unemployed. Wall Street had collapsed. We saw what happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany. The Weimar Republic, like the United States during the Roaring '20s, was vibrant, dynamic, and economically advancing. And then the Great Depression hit. And 3 years later, the Nazi Party, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, emerged. The United States had the opposite experience. And this is worth noting. We didn't get Hitler. We got FDR. And Franklin Roosevelt was possibly the most extraordinary president in our entire history. I know Lincoln and Washington are also the great ones. There's the troika of great presidents. Washington for establishing the republic, and then having the wisdom to step down after 8 years when he could have become a king. Lincoln, because against the advice of all his counselors and the popular sentiment of his day, realized that the South could not be allowed to secede and was willing to go to what became known as the Civil War to save the Union. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt began what has come to be known by history as the New Deal. Social Security was established. The great land lease developments, the insertion of the federal government very proactively to create work projects and employment throughout the land. The radical democratization of the economy and the participation of the public really gave rise for the first time in American history to a massive middle class. Education was provided. In many places, healthcare was provided. And so what Roosevelt achieved, and the reason why he kept being reelected and reelected to 4 times, so finally he died in office in 1944 as the Second World War was drawing to an end, having presided over the greatest military achievement possibly in the history, certainly of modern times, where the United States, because of the vibrancy of its people and the solidity of its polity, was able to engage in a 2-front war over 2 vast oceans and bring the enemy, Germany and Europe and Japan in Asia, to a point of unconditional surrender. That was an extraordinary achievement. And the Democratic Party, infused with the middle class, with an ideology of helping people live useful, full employment, educated, holistic lives, dominated American politics till the early 1970s. Let's say 1968, when Richard Nixon became president of the United States, employing what was called then the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy shifted the tectonic plates of American politics as the Republicans, under the guidance of various consultants like Lee Atwater and others, headed by Richard Nixon, began to develop the rhetoric and the politics of racism, law and order, in an attempt to seize the South away from the Democrats. And that's exactly what happened. All these code words that implied white supremacy, racial discrimination, began to be employed systematically by the Republicans, along with the implementation of what they called the Powell Memo, written in 1972, that has guided the Republican Party to the present day. At that time, the Democrats were still dominant in the Congress. And even though Richard Nixon became president, he was forced to resign. And then Jimmy Carter became president. But the Southern Strategy persisted. And the Powell Strategy, whereby the Republicans began what is essentially a 50-year strategy of going to ground, winning local elections, taking control of state houses, and building from the ground up, investing in media, began to develop a momentum that has led to the electoral map we've all been seeing, that it's mostly red. And that's the result of a 50-year strategy that has been assiduously implemented, including packing the courts with conservative judges. At the same time, in the 1970s, really beginning in the late 1970s, Ralph Nader names the year as 1979. The Democrats began to shift from a middle class base to a corporate base. And the middle class values that had built the Democratic Party into this behemoth were surrendered to a corporatist strategy of raising as much money as you possibly can and engaging in media manipulation and essential propaganda rather than speaking to the essential grounding values of the Democratic Party. And one of the things that began to emerge is identity politics as different constituencies, the women, the people of color, the LGBTQ, trans, gender fluidity groups, all kinds of constituencies began to come into the Democratic Party and supersede the basic middle class values that had built the party. And therefore, what we have seen in the American polity is this transposition of values between the Republicans, who were the party of Lincoln. He was the first Republican president, standing for civil rights, standing for liberal economics and so forth. They went to their opposite and began their Southern strategy. And that's really a strategy of activating xenophobia, hatred, and fear. And the Democrats left their base in the middle class and began to kowtow to Wall Street and the corporate interests, and thereby began to become a party dominated by an elite, these super delegates, so-called, that no longer represented the mainstream values of Americans writ large. Now, this is an important point because what we have seen in the Democratic Party, if you start to serve the corporations, you become the party of war. The Democratic Party has become the war party. And again, in this extraordinary inversion, the Republicans, who used to be the militaristic party, huge defense budgets and so forth and so on, are now the party that wants to weaken the global infrastructure and make America great again, wanting to withdraw from Ukraine, for example, and question NATO. The Democrats are now the war party. And I think that is what led to the collapse of the Biden-Harris campaign. And within this context, knowing that there are many issues and facts and countervailing understandings that we can go into, I'm just trying to paint in the few minutes I have a big picture. But this is what gave rise, I think, to the collapse of the Democratic Party in this election. Biden and Harris presided over an absolutely cataclysmic foreign policy. Not since the Second World War has any president started and maintained conflicts in so many areas of the world as Joe Biden and his vice president, Kamala Harris. I've mentioned several times before that the genesis of the foreign policy formation of the United States when the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, articulated initially by Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and others in the Pentagon, and issuing a defense guidance memorandum till 2030, calling for full spectrum dominance of the United States over the global order. A principal constituent of which was the breakup of Russia and dominance over China. That neoconservative policy formation has guided the United States ever since, without exceptions. It didn't matter whether it was Bush Sr. or Bush Jr., whether it was Clinton, whether it was Obama, whether it was Trump, and then culminating with Biden. The United States has basically been in perpetual war with an attempt to secure full spectrum dominance. And as I've indicated on many broadcasts of Humanity Rising, the Ukraine war and the active US support for Israeli genocide and expansionism in the Middle East will be remembered, in my view, as the death knell of Pax Americana. The reality of our world is that this policy formation is not only morally bankrupt and politically dysfunctional, it is catalyzing a geostrategic shift of power as Russia, China, India, Iran, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Brazil, Turkey, and upwards of 100 countries that are in the process of joining the BRICS coalition unite against this American drive for full spectrum dominance. The most fundamental mistake that Kamala Harris made was in not separating herself from Joe Biden. So not only did she make the mistake of thinking, all I have to do really is malign Trump and tell the American people how bad he is, which didn't work. Every opportunity she was given by the press to separate herself from Joe Biden, she refused. We all know that the polling approval for Joe Biden was the lowest in American history since the polling. So for Kamala Harris to time after time indicate loyalty to this sinking ship was a disaster. And that's why the 10 million people who showed up in previous elections didn't even bother to vote. It's important to bear in mind that 80 million eligible Americans did not vote in this election. Because 80 million Americans don't believe that there's any point in voting. And this includes, by the way, people like Jeffrey Sachs, professor of economics and the environment at Columbia University. He's a world-famous economist. And he stated publicly on several occasions that he was not going to vote because either choice was anathema to the values that he believes in And I think this is true for millions of Americans out there. So the foreign policy adventures of the Biden administration had a blowback in America, because even if you control the mainstream media, social media allows people to see the daily scenes of mass murder in Gaza, to see what's going on in Ukraine, to understand what's going on in China. There's a lot of voices now in the global commons that are accessible to people. And particularly, I think the mass murder in Gaza eroded confidence that Kamala Harris, who basically said she represented a continuation of Biden's politics, could stand against someone like Trump with his charismatic personality and very clear policy formations. Think for a minute. We know what Trump stands for. Sealed borders. Negotiating peace abroad. Drill, baby, drill. And a point I'll return to, the evisceration of what Steve Bannon calls the administrative state. Go after the deep state. That's pretty clear. In addition to which, he's going to be dictator. He's very clear. Think for a minute what Kamala Harris was representing, and it gets really fuzzy, with the exception of her defense of the sovereignty of women. But she really didn't have much of a vision or carefully delineated policies that really spoke to the mass middle of America. So 80 million people didn't even bother to vote. Trump kept his 70 million, and the Democrats fell by 10 million. And therein is the election. Now, I want to make a couple of concluding remarks about what is in store. And then I'd like to open it up for any comments that any of you would like to make, which is one reason why I'm keeping my remarks brief, so that we can really talk about this. When Trump talks about being a dictator, when the Republicans talk about going after the deep state, what we need to, I think, use as a filter to understand what that means is Project 2025 that was written by the Heritage Foundation. What you see in that document is a call for the elimination of the Department of Energy, the evisceration of the EPA, if not the complete collapse of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, stripping down any regulations that inhibit strong corporate growth, tax cut for the rich. That's what's going to happen now, is the corporate tax rate cuts that Trump implemented during his first administrations are going to be voted on again by the Congress, and no doubt passed and maybe increased. The politicization of the FBI and the Justice Department, continuing to pack the Supreme Court and courts all over the United States with ultra-conservative judges. The assault on women will continue. We saw that local elections a few days ago, even though people were voting as a majority for Trump, a similar majority in 6 states voted to sustain the right of a woman over her own body. But many of those states implemented increased restrictions. That is going to continue. Again, referring back to Project 2025, there will be a sustained assault on woke culture. The elimination of books in libraries that talk about love between individuals, irrespective of gender. Talk about slavery and the Civil War. That's being systematically eliminated. There will be a rise in Christian nationalism and Christian dominionism. Many of the closest supporters of Donald Trump are evangelical Christians who, like Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, are devoted Protestant fundamentalists who believe that Christianity needs to be the bedrock and cornerstone of the republic in the United States. And all that is now going to come into play. And the Democratic Party is going to somehow have to reinvent itself. And it's within this context that I want to tell the story of Bernie Sanders, because I think it exemplifies the middle-class values of FDR that built the Democratic majority, and the way he was sidelined by the Democratic Party elite demonstrates why Trump just won the last election. Remember in 2016, there was this epic struggle between Hillary Clinton on the one hand, the corporatist war candidate, highly militarized. She had been a highly aggressive Secretary of State under Barack Obama. That was what she represented. Bernie Sanders came in saying, let's go back to FDR. Let's champion the working class. Let's work for universal health care. Let's raise the minimum wage, which is too low to make a living. Let's have education for all. Let's go after the corporate elites and call them to justice. Let's take on the pharmaceutical companies. And let's challenge the highly militarized U.S. foreign policy. And even though he started to win one primary after another, what did the Clintons do? They brought in the superdelegates. And even though Bernie Sanders represented the majority will of the Democratic base, there was essentially a coup. And the party elite, backed by the corporate money, won the nomination. And Bernie Sanders was sidelined. And Hillary lost. So Bernie tried to do it again. And the same thing happened, but this time as Bernie was rising, Joe Biden was brought into the race. And the corporate war machine brought him into the ascendancy. And because of the devastation of the first Trump administration, Biden won. And what we've seen for the last 4 years is a presidency dedicated to corporate power and escalating war around the world, including, most unconscionably, support for Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. I want to make a very important optical point. Not once did Kamala Harris campaign with Bernie Sanders. Not once. She campaigned with Liz Cheney. She campaigned with Beyonce and various rock stars and celebrities. She specifically eschewed any relationship with Bernie Sanders, even though the policies of Bernie Sanders, including calling for the United States to stop military aid to Israel, was where the base of the Democratic Party really is. And it's that abdication, that fissure between the corporatist elite of the Democratic Party and the grassroots of the Democratic Party that still remains essentially progressive that caused the collapse in the voter turnout that gave the election to Donald Trump. If 15% of the low-wage workers in America who didn't vote, if only 15% of them had voted for a candidate speaking to their issues of universal health care, of education for all, of middle-class values and a pathway to achieve it, Kamala Harris would be the president-elect of the United States. So what we're witnessing as the newly formed Republican Party of Trump takes power in Washington, the Democratic Party has fundamental issues with which it has to grapple, because we know that the Republicans will now do everything they can to gerrymander, to pack the courts, to eviscerate the regulatory frameworks that have guided the democracy for 100 years, to unleash oil drilling that will radically escalate climate change, and potentially bring about the demise of the American Republic. I think I'll leave it at that because I want to get people to comment. And what I'm going to do, if you've got anything you'd like to say on in the chat, please do. If you have questions and answers, there's the Q&A function if you want to ask a question. We can talk about that for the balance of our time. I have to leave in 45 minutes for a meeting on the Hill that I need to get to, so I won't be able to join the after chat. So I thought we would turn the session now into something like an after chat so people can make their comments and questions. And if I could ask you to just put those in the Q&A function, that would be very helpful to me, so I don't have to look at both. And I'll start with Diane Sue's question about my thoughts on the involvement of the evangelical movement and on the impact of race and gender dynamics on the election results. I've touched on this, but I think it's worth expanding in the following way. The dominance of Christianity in America is inexorably receding. Not only is America becoming more and more secular, but America is becoming more and more, I would say, New Age. And what I mean by New Age, I'm talking about gender fluidity. I'm talking about woke, all the issues that were pioneered in the 1960s have come to fruition, representing a new way of human beings interacting with each other beyond the strictures of Christian ethical norms and constraints. That's a beautiful thing about what's happening in the United States. And that's what's under attack. So what happens historically when a majority starts to become a minority and yet doesn't want to give up its power because it's absolutely certain that it is holder of truth? That decreasing majority into a minority begins to use all kinds of devious and coercive mechanisms to maintain power. That's why the Powell memo of 1972 worked so masterfully for the Republicans. They understood then that they were in the process of becoming the minority in the United States as people of color, of all kinds of new thought forms and perspectives began to flourish in the USA. So what we're seeing is an alliance between the collapsing Judeo-Christian, let's call it Christian dominionist bloc, which used to be at the end of the Second World War, roughly 50%, is now under 20%. So they're compensating, as you see with the Republicans, more and more devious ways to keep in power, even though they're losing the popular base. And that's the tragedy of the Democrats. All those people are theirs for the taking if they would cease being the power of the corporate elites and the war machine and go back to the fundamental middle-class values that brought FDR into power and ushered in Democratic Party dominance of the American political situation for the next 50 years. And that's what Bernie Sanders was trying to rekindle, and he was squelched. So the Christian dominionists are having a field day right now because they understand that Trump is in some ways the last gasp, the last opportunity to so pack the courts and so distort the electoral process that they can maintain power indefinitely into the future, no matter what the population demographics are. Jonathan, Paul de Verville, what will MPI be doing during the time before the new administration? I continue to work on the UAP disclosure, as you all know. We have hearing in the House, chaired by Congresswoman Nancy Mace next Wednesday. We're actively working with her office, and that's why I have to leave at 12:30 my time, because there's very interesting alignments taking place. and the New Paradigm Institute is right in the middle of it. We're also working with Senator Gillibrand's office for the Senate hearing on the 19th. We've established a major strategic alliance with MUFON, with the Mutual UFO Network, and we're coming together. We're holding a press event right after the hearing next Wednesday on the 13th of November. We are reaping the rewards of hundreds of citizens for disclosure groups around the country. We now have citizen groups in all 50 states, or just about, and in a couple dozen countries around the world. The Citizens for Disclosure groups had one goal for this election, and that is to make the UAP disclosure issue an election issue. We didn't quite achieve that, but what we did get is both presidential candidates were asked about it, and Kamala Harris' response was, don't ask me that question again, in a very aggressive way. And Donald Trump on multiple occasions said, I think this is interesting. I'd like to see more disclosure. And one of the realities is that Donald Trump may become the disclosure president, in part because Robert Kennedy Jr., who's passionate about disclosure, is emerging as one of the principal individuals in the group surrounding Trump. So there's a number of people in the Trump retinue now that are for disclosure. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist in the campaign of Kamala Harris. But we are working with AOC and Jamie Raskin. We're hopeful that we can include them in a press event that we're planning for right after the hearing next Wednesday. So I continue to be deeply engaged in congressional politics at multiple levels as best I can, given my other responsibilities, including Humanity Rising, that occupy my time. But it's a very exciting moment. And as I've mentioned before, one of the characteristics and the beautiful things about the UAP disclosure movement is that it's bipartisan. Most of the congressional reps that we're working with are Trump supporters, and on sort of the extreme right of the Republican Party, Tim Burchett, for example, and others. But when we're dealing with UAP disclosure, that doesn't matter. That becomes an interesting point of maybe dinner conversation sometime. But what we're really working on is to build a collaborative matrix in the Congress from both sides of the aisle to make sure that this disclosure process continues. It's a very, very exciting moment in Washington. Victor P. If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. Emma Goldman. That's everything you should know about elections. The reason they call it the American dream is because you have to be asleep to believe it. George Carlin. Do you really believe voting can change anything at all? Do you have any proof of that? Well, Victor, I take your point. You know, the bumper sticker, no matter whoever you vote for, the government wins. Completely agree. And in the spirit of Carl Jung, the opposite is true. And that is, voting makes a fundamental difference. Absolutely, it does. What if the Democrats had voted for Bernie Sanders rather than Hillary Clinton? All the polls showed that he was going to beat Donald Trump. What if Kamala Harris had won this election rather than Donald Trump? The next 4 years would be completely different. voting matters. That's why I vote. That's why all of us should vote. If the 80 million people who didn't vote had have voted, I guarantee you there would have probably been a different outcome. So while I certainly take your point, and the vested interests of the corporate policy, war, military industrial complex have insidiously infused themselves into the political process. And there's less and less engagement between the political class and the political elites and the ordinary citizens, and increasing manipulation of social media and mainstream media. Who's president of the United States makes a big difference. 4 years ago, at the end of the Trump administration, the United States was not at war. Trump made that a point. Sitting down with Putin, sitting down with Kim Il-jung in North Korea, sitting down with people that were in conflict. He was pilloried by the mainstream media for his relationship with Vladimir Putin, when all he was doing was what any president in the past, like Richard Nixon, would have done under similar circumstances. If the guy across the table has more nuclear weapons than you do, you sit down and you talk to them. When Joe Biden won, he brought in that corporatist military industrial complex with him, the neocon mentality led by Anthony Blinken in the State Department and Jake Sullivan and his national security advisor and Victoria Nuland and others, and spawned 3 major wars in 4 years against Russia in Ukraine, with Israel in the Middle East, and escalating conflict with China. So absolutely, voting matters in my book. And what we have to do is assess, the I Ching says that the best way to combat evil is to make energetic progress in the good. And the I Ching also says that the superior person looks for the error within themselves. I'm a Democrat. I've been a registered Democrat since I was 18 years old. I think on balance, the policies and values of Franklin Delano Roosevelt are what I stand for and what I've lived my life by. And it's grieved me that people like Bernie Sanders had been cut out of the leadership echelon in the Democratic Party. And I think we've paid a price. And I believe that we need to rectify that by looking for the error within ourselves and doing what's needful in the new administration and hopefully in the elections in 2026. It's important to remember, and this is another example. Remember back in 1980, Ronald Reagan swept Jimmy Carter in a landslide and took both houses of Congress. By 1982, in that election, the Democrats got back into control because the electorate saw what Reagan was doing. And even though there's mythology about Ronald Reagan today, particularly in the Republican Party, at that time, only 2 years later, his policies were rejected by a majority of Americans. So this could happen again. But in order for it to happen, the Democrats have to find their base and reorient themselves to the values that built the majority under FDR in the first place. At least that's my view. That's my view. Question, Mark Weinstein. You mentioned the Democrats have become America's war party since the 1970s. How do you understand Democratic support for the Vietnam War? I was there. I remember Lyndon Baines Johnson. I remember Gene McCarthy. I remember Bobby Kennedy, who I voted for in that California primary on June 5th, 1968, and was very apprised that the Democratic Party was being swept into the war machine, but the reaction against it, remember, by Gene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy, caused Lyndon Johnson to essentially resign from the presidency and say that he wasn't going to run. And then, of course, that gave rise to Richard Nixon and the Southern strategy of the Republicans and the implementation of the Powell Memo in 1972. So that's another example of where elections really matter, because who wins really can make a difference. Elizabeth Haynes, I got a hit in the middle of the night. We as people have the agency to react, influence what the government will be dictating. We can react, protest against anything on our local level. We won't submit. Absolutely, Elizabeth. Absolutely. We have to continue to work to protect the sovereignty of women. We have to continue to work, in my judgment, to protest against U.S. policy in the Middle East. And the difference between Biden and Trump on the Middle East is, while Biden had a conscience, I believe, that caused him to essentially keep apologizing and saying, isn't it awful, and I wish they would stop, although he never did anything to force the Israelis to stop. With Trump, there's going to be no apology. There's going to be full bore support for the Israeli genocide and the Israeli war machine, and possibly war against Iran itself. And that's one reason why the atomic clock is as close to midnight in terms of the possible use of thermonuclear weapons. The dominance of the evangelical Christians and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who said, basically, isn't it a shame that we can't turn Gaza into beachfront property? That's the mentality that will now govern the Trump administration in the Middle East. And it could not be more dangerous. I really think that if Kamala won, there would be a more moderate policy, but not by much. So we absolutely have to stay engaged at every level that we can to continue to make democracy function, because I think we're looking at the very realistic prospect of the collapse of democracy in America and the rise of the tyrant, as Plato in the Republic predicts always happen in a democracy in decline. I wonder why the Latino vote may have gone so clearly in Trump's direction, or is that true? It's absolutely true. And that's an interesting point, Tricia, to bring up, because the Latinos in this country want strong borders. And that's what the Democrats don't understand. And I think if there's the domestic equivalent to the egregious mistakes that the Biden administration made in terms of foreign policy and war, it's our border policy. When Trump ended his presidency, the number of people coming across the border had shrunk to historic lows. Overnight, the Biden administration opened the borders. And sometimes tens of thousands were coming across every day. Where were they going? They were going to the Latino communities across the United States, homeless, without any, in some cases, passport or ID cards, and didn't speak any English. So the Latino communities, the people who were here legally, and even the families that had been here for some time, and the children were legal and the others weren't legal, and so forth and so on. They were living, I would say, a stable but precarious existence. And then all of a sudden, over the last 4 years, thousands and thousands of undocumented aliens came across the borders, and not just Latinos, people from Africa, people from Asia. It's extraordinary. And the Biden administration did almost nothing to stop it. And if there's one issue that galvanized the Republican Party, and I think the American electorate, it was the inability and refusal of the Biden administration to control the borders. It could have been done. Countries all over the world control their borders. Try to get into Russia. Try to get into, France, Britain, if you're an undocumented alien. Look how many ships sink in the Mediterranean. There's all kinds of ways to deal with this. And I, for one, take the position that the reason why there are so many undocumented aliens is because of US policy in Latin America and around the world that is destabilizing these countries for financial, economic, and political hegemony. And that's why they're refugees, and that's why they're coming into Europe and coming into the United States. So I take a position that we need to systematically solve this issue by rectifying the conditions out of which the refugees come. But failing that, I think the American public, by and large, supports a closed border policy at this time, including the Latinos. In the exit polls, they were saying that the immigration position of Kamala Harris and the Democrats was not acceptable to them. So that was a real issue for the electorate in this election. And this is worth just saying, this is where the dictator comes in. Rather than implementing judicious policies, humane policies, we're going to see children in cages again. Trump is saying that on day one, there's going to be mass deportations. Can you imagine what's going to happen in communities all over America as the police and the Border Patrol come in and start seizing people, splitting up families, putting people in detainment centers, concentration camps? That's what dictatorship is. But it's happening because the Democrats did not use their 4 years in a judicious way to solve the problem. And now the solution is going to be even worse the second time around. And that's a real tragedy. It's a total human tragedy that is about ready to unfold. Janice Hall, please address RFK. He took his base to Trump, and so many are young and come from the regenerative movement, agriculture, and health. Well, as you all know, I know Bobby Jr., had many interactions with him, not recently, of course, and as had Danny Sheehan, the president of the New Paradigm Institute. He's been on Humanity Rising, and I was an initial strong supporter of RFK. He was treated so badly, as was Marianne Williamson, by the Democratic Party, as the DNC basically cut any dissent out of the primary process in their effort to protect Joe Biden, because it was clear to the Democratic Party elite that Joe Biden was not capable mentally of the kind of to and fro and debate that has historically characterized the Democratic Party. We saw this in the one debate that he had with Donald Trump. He just wasn't mentally competent to have the debate. And that's why within a month he'd collapsed. Joe Biden personally countermanded selective service protection for Bobby Kennedy Jr. And to me, that was unconscionable. We know what's happened to the Kennedy family. We know that Bobby Kennedy Jr. was a lightning rod. And for the President of the United States to refuse to give him Secret Service protection, I thought was beyond the beyond. And that's why he eventually went as an independent candidate. And then when he joined the Trump campaign, it was because Trump, unlike Kamala Harris, who refused to even meet with him, said, yeah, let's talk. What do you have in mind? And Kennedy brought to the Trump campaign his passion about children's health and the health of the American people. And it may well be that he'll be nominated by Trump to be the head of the Food and Drug Administration or the Ministry of Health and Human Services, within the context of which he could do a lot of good for the American public, which isn't possible in any kind of Democratic administration because the Democrats have lost the democratic impulse. Let me say that again. The Democrats have lost the democratic impulse. They've become subservient to the corporate imperative and the war machine. That's why they cut out Bernie Sanders and have cut out any debate against Joe Biden. And the statement that Bobby Kennedy Jr. made when he said that he was now in conversations with Trump, he said, historically, this has happened all the time, where Republicans enter Democratic administrations and Democrats are brought into Republican administrations. And in fact, Kamala Harris even said that she would appoint a Republican in her cabinet. So this is not unusual. But in a time of polarized politics, what Robert Kennedy Jr. did in going with the candidate that was really honoring what he was trying to do, including, by the way, with Ukraine. Bobby Jr. understands that the United States is engaged in a complete debacle in Ukraine. So J.D. Vance understands this. And that's why, even though the Biden administration was slowly disengaging from Ukraine, I think that separation is going to be expedited under Donald Trump. And it'll be due to some degree by Bobby Kennedy Jr. I believe rightly, as you all know. And so Bobby Kennedy is his own man. He's trying to make a difference in the health and well-being of Americans. And if a Republican president lets him do that, and a Democratic president won't even meet with him, what choice do you believe he should make? And I want everybody to pause here for a moment, because our politics are so polarized that we can't any longer see that going across the aisle, working in a collaborative way, as the Democrats and Republicans did routinely in the 50s and 60s and 70s, even in the 80s. You know, the Environmental Protection Agency was started by Richard Nixon. Those were days in which Republicans and Democrats had multiple coalitions back and forth, given different bills. The Civil Rights Act in 1965 was supported by a good number of Republicans. That's inconceivable today, that Republicans and Democrats would align on any issue except for the issue of UAP disclosure. That's one of the reasons why I'm in such a constant state of excitement here in Washington, is because it's the only issue that the Democrats and the Republicans are actually united behind. It's really remarkable. So I respect Bobby Kennedy. I respect his integrity. I respect his courage. And if he can make a difference in the Trump administration, all strength to him, because we need people like Kennedy in the area of public health. 50 years ago, the United States was the healthiest country in the world. Now we rank 79th, under Nicaragua, in terms of general public health. Bobby Kennedy Jr. knows a lot about that, and I would like to see him empowered to work for the betterment of all America in the Trump administration. And in that sense, it's really important for us to overcome our own ideological condescension of the other party and recognize that sometimes there is some good that comes out of Nazareth, to paraphrase the biblical prophecy. Susan, Hess Logier, hi. What are your thoughts on the message shared by the Kogi regarding the mother releasing her waters to cleanse the planet, reducing habitable terrain to 30% of our current landmass? We went to Teotihuacan for the solstice in the spirit of the Kogi prophecy. I believe that we are now in a day and time of reckoning. This is what the Kogi and all manner of indigenous prophecy is saying to us, that the little brother, meaning the white race in particular, and the United States and the colonial powers in particular, have lost their way. And we need to return to the mother. And it's no longer a question of time. We don't have till 2030. We certainly don't have till 2050. The reckoning is happening now. And that, to me, is the great tragedy of the election of Trump. In the face of a collapsing ecosystem, the last thing you want to do is drill, baby, drill. The tragedy of the Biden administration is they produced more oil than at any time of American history. And the fact that the governing elites, Democrat and Republican, have so obscenely forfeited their responsibility to curate the ecological sanctity of this planet makes me want to weep. Because that reckoning is coming. And I believe that sometime in 25, 26, 27, as the Kogi are predicting, and climate scientists are predicting, we're going to see an extinction event that will shake the foundations of human civilization. I think that's what the Kogi are speaking to when they say only 30% of the world will remain. I think there's something, you can't continue to act as egregiously as we are without consequence. And I think we are now in the realm of consequence. And that's what's important for us to bear in mind at this time. George Orbelian. Buckminster Fuller shared many solutions relevant to now. I'm on the board of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Good for you, George, and always available to share. George, we ought to talk. Send me an email. Let's get the Bucky Fuller Institute on Humanity Rising. Bucky Fuller was one of my heroes, I have to say. I loved him when I was a teenager and growing up in the 60s, and his inspiration that, you don't combat the bad guys, you just build a new creative future. And that has really inspired my life. So he's he's one of my mentors, Buckminster Fuller. Great mind, you know, a Renaissance mind, a holographic mind full of goodwill and creative genius. So, George, good on you. And let's talk. I'd like to get a session or two to remind people of the genius of Buckminster Fuller and what it means to really, you know, as the I Ching says, the best way to combat evil is to make energetic progress in the good. And that's why I feel so energetic being here in Washington. We're making a lot of energetic progress in the good because I believe that this new ingredient, if you have Kogi prophecy, you have the ETs all saying the same thing. We're in reckoning. We have to fundamentally transform our ways. Then for me, working to bring in the ET awareness is an incredibly exciting thing. And I want to say just parenthetically for everyone, because I can see I'm running out of time. I work in the Congress and I love working in the Congress and it's exciting. And there's something, you know, exhilarating about walking the halls of Congress. But you know what's even more exciting to me is the training program that we have between the New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity University, not only to teach people about the history, law, and politics of UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, but more exciting, which we're going to start in January. We have a whole certificate program on how to learn how to speak intelligibly with extraterrestrials. I believe that if everyone listening to this broadcast would commit themselves to start learning remote viewing and mental telepathy with a specific intent to communicate with extraterrestrials, and we began a global campaign so that by 2030, there's hundreds of millions, if not billions, of human beings that are communicating on a regular basis with ETs, I believe the world would change. I believe that human transformation would take place. Because you get a twofer. You not only learn ET at a moment when humanity's entering into its cosmic moment, but the very act of learning how to communicate in an intelligible way with other species and with extraterrestrials elevates your consciousness. And that's back to Einstein. That the consciousness that produced the problem can't solve the problem. That's why we're in such a mess. We need a third ingredient. And I believe that's the advent of the extraterrestrials on the one hand, and the emerging wisdom of the indigenous peoples on the other hand. And that's one of the things that motivates me in my work at the New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity University. How do we bring both of these things together? So that the wisdom of our primordial ancestors, who've been talking and communicating with the ETs all along, how does this inform the way humanity needs to now embrace the extraterrestrials and enter into its cosmic moment? That to me is excitement. I'm taking the whole week off, and we'll be sending out this course, but between the 15th and the 19th of January with Bertie Jaworski, we're going to have a 5-day intensive, 8 hours a day for 5 days, to learn remote viewing with a specific intent of communicating with the extraterrestrials. Everybody should avail yourselves to that. If you want to do something to change history, you need to vote at the human level. You need to learn how to communicate with the extraterrestrials at the cosmic level. That's the opportunity for humanity in this moment. One last question. Cuff, good to see you, Cuff. Cuff Ferguson's one of my favorite people. He's done a number of sessions and programs actually on Humanity Rising. So thank you, Cuff. Why do you think so many people succumb to the gaslighting tactics used by Trump? Since in my humble view, Trump represents the shadow of the US, unable to embrace women, Black women in particular, in power. Kamala also is her own person. She was put in an impossible situation. I think she did a great job in a very short period of time, 3 months versus 10 years for Trump. Great point. Great point. I think that, as Carl Jung said, the rise of fascism can take place when people lose their grounding in nature. And I think that's what's happened to the American people and to most of the industrial developed world. Most of us live in urban centers and we're cut off from nature. When this takes place, Jung said, we become susceptible to all manner of gaslighting by the Trump campaign, by the US government, by the corporations. Gaslighting is happening every day on TV with one commercial after another, telling us to be happy, you need to buy this product and that product and this car and that car. So rekindling whatever it is that connects us back into nature is an extraordinary task at hand and a very important thing to do. And that's one reason why learning how to speak with other species, learning ET, is a way of reconnecting into the larger cosmic natural order of things. And I think much more can be said, but let me address the second part of your question. And I think that's absolutely correct. I think Joe Biden is not only culpable for instigating an administration devoted to war, but he succumbed to the arrogance of believing that he was infallible and indispensable, when in fact the reality was he was in mental decline. We should all remember that in 2020, when he started his campaign, he says, I'm running to save America from Trump, and I'm only going to serve 4 years. If he'd have kept to that promise and groomed Kamala for 4 years for the presidency, I believe she would have won. So you're absolutely correct, Cuff. She had less than 3 months because Joe Biden hung on for too long till finally he was forced out in what is usually called a coup. This was a palace coup. He didn't go out on his own free will. He was forced out by the same elite in the Democratic Party that forced out Bernie Sanders. And they did it too late. And Kamala never really had a chance, because one of the exit polls across the country that of people who voted for Trump is they said, I know Trump. I didn't know Kamala Harris. And so that's another mistake of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden in particular, that could have been rectified if he'd have kept to his basic promise, I'll be a one-term president. If he'd have done that, everyone, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're here today. Let me conclude with a note on the shadow. I said yesterday that we are in the moment of the Pluto return for the United States. where Pluto was in our natal chart on July 4th, 1776, Pluto 248 years later, this is where we are right now. Pluto is the shadow. Pluto is the god of Hades, the god of hell, the Dionysian disruption into deliriums and seductions of power and violence. I think the Pluto return had an extraordinary gravitational effect on Biden and his ceaseless warmongering. That's Pluto. And now, right at the moment of Pluto's return, the Americans have voted in the tyrant. And how we, as progressives, how those of us who believe in a better world and don't want to drill, baby, drill, but be in alignment with free energy and with renewable energies, don't want to see perpetual war and genocide, but a world in which human beings love each other, work with each other, are in harmony with the environment, and are embracing our extraterrestrial neighbors as we expand our psyches from the terrestrial realm to the cosmic realm. How we navigate now through the reckoning predicted by the Kogis that is now going to be accelerated by the Trump administration. We should ponder this very carefully because the answer is not so obvious. One thing is we can learn from Saint Benedict in the 4th century when the Roman Empire was collapsing. And the Benedictines went throughout the empire and began to collect the books and the wisdom of deep antiquity because they knew that the barbarians were at the gate. And they secreted them in the monasteries. The difference between us today and Saint Benedict in the 4th century is that the barbarians are not on the frontiers. They've been ruling us for some time. And it's our lack of awareness of this that constitutes the main part of our predicament. I believe we're in that kind of an age. We need to tend to how we protect the wisdom of the primordial against an assault that's now coming. We need to understand more deeply how we build community in a world where the centrifugal forces are trying to break up community. We need to attune ourselves to the deep wisdom of the past and the wisdom that's coming down to us from the heavens at a moment when that is being fought against by the very forces that have kept the UFO phenomenon secret for 80 years. When the shadow is ascendant, the good, the light, must secure itself very judiciously to ensure that it can navigate through the darkness in a way that begins to build the momentum that will turn the darkness into the light. And that's the task of people of goodwill in our time, is to keep fast to the light, to keep fast to each other, and to keep clear that in the end, the universe bends toward justice. And our mission is to make it so. Thank you, everyone. So appreciate Humanity Rising. We'll see you tomorrow. There is an after chat. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join it, but I hope that you continue this dialogue and that Humanity Rising continues to explore these very important, complex, and urgently impactful domains. Bye for now. See you tomorrow.